nanohub.org.
Online simulation and more for nanotechnology.
Good afternoon. We spend all of our lives learning. Okay, so I want to talk about how to make your learning deeper and do it more efficiently. And some of the things I'll tell you about have been known for over 100 years. Some of the things have been recently learned. But these things typically aren't conveyed to students in schools. In fact, often what they tell you contradicts what the research tells you you should be doing. So out of the book, Make It Stick, here's the definition of what learning is. It's acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from your memory so you can make sense of future problems and opportunities. So I think of this as when you learn something, you create a mental model of it. It's a mental representation of some real entity. And then you have to know for a given problem which mental model to access. And when you're working on more complex problems or being creative, you have to be able to retrieve all these different mental models and bring them together. Charlie Munger refers to this as creating a lattice work of mental models. So your brain is only 2% of your body weight, but it uses 20% of your body's energy. Okay, so that if you cut off that supply of energy in less than 10 seconds, your brain stops functioning. That's why if you put someone in a centrifuge and go fast enough, or a fighter pilot pulls out of a dive too fast, they black out because the heart can't pump the blood against the centrifugal force. So some of the things I'll talk about are exercise, nutrition, sleep, meditation, but that's something for next week. Okay, so the starting point is memory because somehow you have to put these things in long-term storage so you can retrieve them when you need them. Okay, we actually have two memory systems. Okay, so the first one is a conscious system, which includes things like facts and episodes. So someone asks you, what's the capital of Indiana? You consciously think, Indianapolis. When you think about something you did last weekend, you're consciously recalling an episode. Then you also have a subconscious memory, and this memory uses different parts of the brain, and it's mainly for procedures. So for instance, when you started to learn how to ride a bike, you probably fell a lot. Now you can get on a bike and ride it no problem, but you don't think. Your brain does all the calculations subconsciously for keeping your balance, turning, and so forth. Same thing when you type. When you started, right index finger, hit the J. Now you don't even think about that. You just type without thinking. Okay, we know a lot about memory thanks to Henry Molaison. Okay, he used to be referred to as patient HM in the literature, but he died in 2008, so now we know who he was. So he had severe epilepsy, and medication wouldn't help. So in 1953, they performed surgery on his brain. They removed his hippocampus. The good news for Henry, it helped his epilepsy quite a bit. The bad news for Henry, but the good news for memory researchers, is the effect it had on his memory. One of the people who worked with Henry in the 1950s was Brenda Milner. And I was looking up something on Brenda, and I saw this photograph in 2014. In fact, she's 101 today, and she's still an active researcher and teacher at McGill University. Because she was doing this 65 years ago with Henry. Okay, so one of the things that happened to Henry was he still retained the long-term memories he had before surgery. So he knew names of his parents, where he was born, who the President of the United States was. But he could not acquire any new long-term memories. Okay, so the hippocampus isn't where long-term memories are stored, but it plays an important role in acquiring these long-term memories. In fact, when we get to talking about sleep next time, we'll learn that during the day, you're putting things in short-term memory in your hippocampus, and it's when you're sleeping that they get transferred to long-term storage sites. So every day when Brenda would go in to see Henry, he was meeting her for the first time. Okay? It's like the movie 50 First Dates, if you've seen it. So Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore meet and fall in love. Adam shows up the next day and Drew doesn't know who he is. So someone tells him about her condition, not being able to put anything in long-term memory. So every day he has to get Drew to fall in love with him again. Brenda also discovered these two memory systems we have. So Henry couldn't put anything in long-term memory anymore, but he could learn procedures. Now, it wasn't riding a bike, but let's assume Henry didn't know how to ride a bike. So Brenda went in and said, "Henry, do you know how to ride a bike?" And he said, "No." She said, "Let's learn." And so that happened day after day after day. So eventually she would go in there and say, "Henry, do you know how to ride a bike?" He'd say no, and he'd get on the bike and just zip away. He didn't know he had learned how to ride the bike, but he could. Okay, so something really important for putting things in memory is the difference between spaced learning and massed learning. Okay, this was research done in the early 1880s by Hermann Ebbinghaus. He published it in 1885. So he created about 2,000 of these nonsense syllables where the first and second letter were consonants and the middle letter was a vowel. So he would take a set of these and he'd memorize them. Then he'd come back the next day and see how many he remembered. Then came back the next day, see how many he remembered, and so forth. And he saw a gradual decline, something like an exponential decline. Okay, so his next experiment was he came in and he memorized all the words. See if I can do this. So it'd be like this. Then he saw how many he remembered. Then he took the list and rememorized them. So he went back up here. I'm not very good at drawing straight lines. Then he tested after 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and he found he was still forgetting, but now it was a longer time slot, time constant. So the next experiment, and I won't try to draw. So he memorized the words, came back the next day, saw how many he knew, rememorized the whole list, came back the next day, saw how many he knew, then rememorized the list, then came back the next day, the next day, the next day. So now he was even on a longer time constant. So by spacing it, you slow down your forgetting. Now this is an important point. So let's say it took him an hour to memorize the words. And then he spent another 2 hours working on them to try to really put them in memory. Come back the next day, he's down here. But if he used the same amount of time, the 3 hours, on 3 consecutive days, he would have more deeply remembered that material. So you don't want to do this blocked mass studying of a particular subject. You want to split it out and spread it out in time. You'll remember things better, and there's other reasons which we'll get to later. Now, when you forget something, what is it? Is it the memory has disappeared or the memory is harder to retrieve? And I should mention these forgetting curves were also referred to as the law of disuse, that if you disuse something in memory, it decays away. Okay, so there's now a new theory of disuse. And that theory says you have an unlimited storage capacity. You have 100 billion neurons, and they can make thousands of connections with other neurons. So there's no limit in the capacity. Where the difficulty comes in is retrieving something you already have in memory. The retrieval strength fades when you don't use it, as we've seen, and that's a very useful thing. So when you leave here, you want to know where you parked your car earlier today, not where you parked it 2 weeks ago, right? Same thing 50,000 years ago, when you were going out to find food, where were you finding the food yesterday, not last year? You know, where did you see the predators yesterday, not 6 months ago, right? So forgetting is actually useful. You need that more recent information more readily available. And you can kind of prove it to yourself. You know, you probably had this experience where you were trying to think of someone's name, but you couldn't. But if you were shown 4 names, 3 you'd never seen before, but the 4th one you were trying to remember, it popped right into your head then. You were given that cue to help you retrieve that memory. So, memory and other things like focus, self-discipline that we'll talk about later, you can think of it's like lifting weights. Okay, if you want to get stronger, you don't go into the gym and lift weights for 8 hours, right? You'll go in and lift for an hour, come back a few days later and lift for an hour. Your memory, your focus, your willpower all work the same way. Now, this was stated very succinctly by William James in 1901. So cramming, that's the same as this masked or blocked trying to learn, you know, spend all day the day before the test to learn something. He said, cramming seems to stamp things in by intense application before the ordeal, but a thing thus learned can form few associations. On the other hand, the same thing recurring on different days in different contexts, read, recited, referred to again and again, related to other things and reviewed, gets well wrought into the mental structure. And so he's also alluding to all these different cues that you build in to be able to retrieve something you have in permanent memory. Okay, here's a study to show some of this. Okay, so these students were taught how to do, undergraduates who didn't know how to do permutations, the sort of thing you'd run into in your first probabilistic methods course. So a permutation of this sequence, ABBCC, is the number of different ways you can write it. Okay, and there's 60 of them. Okay, so in one group, they did a spacing where they had 2 lessons. In the other group, they all masked that in one session. Okay, so the spacers were taught how to do it, and then they did 5 problems. They had 45 seconds to do the problem, and then they were shown the solution for 15 seconds. And a week later, they were given 5 more problems. The massers were all taught the technique and then did the same problems, but all 10 of them at once. So a week later, half the spacers and half the massers were tested, and the massers actually did a little bit better there. But the other half of each group was tested 4 weeks later, and you see the spacers got twice as many right. And that was just from doing, you know, one spacing. Here's another example. It was in the training of 38 surgical residents how to do microsurgery, you know, to connect little blood vessels. Okay, so they were assigned randomly to 2 groups, and the way the microsurgery was taught is with 4 lessons. And the first group did all the lessons in one day, and that was typical at this hospital. It's not, after this experiment, it's not typical anymore. The other group had their lessons spaced a week apart, so 4 consecutive weeks. And when they were tested a month after their last lesson, the block group scored lower on everything they judged residence on. You know, how long and the test was they took a rat, severed the aorta, and then they had to reattach the two pieces of the aorta. The block group took longer, a lot more hand movements, and they had lower success. By that, it means 16% of them, their rats died. Okay, none of the rats died for the ones who were trained with the spacing technique. Okay, now let's talk about where you study. Okay, you've probably been given some advice on this somewhere, right? In school, like find a quiet place and just sit there and concentrate a place you always go to study. Okay. So here's one of the first tests or studies on the effect of where you study. So this was off the coast of Scotland. They had 18 scuba divers go down 20 feet and memorize 36 words. Then an hour later, 9 of them took the test on land, and 9 of them went back 20 feet under where they learned the words. Those underwater remembered 30% more of the words. So where they learned the material, there were cues in that environment to help them retrieve those words from their memory. Okay, here was another study with Psych 101 students where they had them study 40 words, and they had them in 3 groups. So one group studied in silence, one group studied with a jazz piece playing in the background, and one group studied with a Mozart piece playing in the background. So they took part of the jazz group and put them in the room playing the same jazz music. They got recalled 21 of the words on average. Same thing with the Mozart group. Putting part of them in a room and playing the same Mozart piece, they recalled 21. But if they took the people who had learned with the jazz playing and then had the Mozart playing, could only remember 11. The same thing if they took the jazz group and then put them in silence. They could only remember 11. And also very interesting, the ones who learned in silence and then were trying to recall in silence only got 11 right. So something about the background sound was adding cues to help retrieve the information from memory. Okay, so here's another one. Okay, so 2 groups, we're going to study 44-letter words. Okay, group 1 was split into 2 groups, and they had 2 10-minute study sessions. So half of group 1 studied in a cluttered basement for both their sessions. The other half of group 1 studied in a brightly lit room for both of their sessions. Group 2 had 1 session in each room, 1 in the cluttered basement, 1 in the bright room. And then they were all tested in a 3rd room. So the group that did both of their study in the brightly lit room or the cluttered basement got 16 words right. The ones who had a study session in 2 different locations got 24 right. So they were either less dependent on the cues or somehow studying in 2 environments provided many more cues for them to recall what was in the memory. So what you should do is vary where you study. You know, don't just study in one place. You probably have a room where it's quiet and you study, but you know, try to go to other places like a library, a coffee shop, or since there's evidence you do better if you take a test where you did your studying, go to the room where you're going to have your test and do some of your studying there. The other thing, this group here has found that having some noise in the background helps in learning. So having a little bit of background noise means you have to work a little harder. And in all the research, it seems that if the studying is a little bit harder, you learn it a little bit better, a little bit deeper. And they found the amount of noise you encounter in a coffee shop is about right. It's enough distraction, but not too much to help you learning. And they even started a website where you can get and play background coffee shop noise when you're studying. Okay, I often have students every semester come and tell me the actual test was harder than the practice tests. In fact, I just had a student tell me that today about a test last week. And then I always ask them, what were the conditions when you took the test? Was it in your quiet room where you've been doing all your studying? Of course it's going to seem easier because you have all these cues from the room in which you studied. Also, often they're not as strict as far as the time limit and having material available, so you might get stuck on a problem and, oh, I'll just glance at something in my notes or the book. Okay, another very important thing to help your learning is something called interleaving. Okay, interleaving is, and this can very easily be used with space learning. It's where you don't do a massive block of studying one thing. You do a little bit of one thing, then another, and so forth. Okay, so it can be different subjects, which is pretty natural if you're in school and taking several courses. In a particular course, it could be mixing the topics you're looking at, or if it's a procedure, it could be mixing up skills. So I'll show one on skills first because this was actually the first time this effect was discovered. So Kerr and Booth were working with 8-year-old kids who were at a Saturday program. And what they had the kids doing was they were kneeling down and throwing a beanbag size, a golf ball size beanbag at a target on the floor. Okay, and one group was throwing at a target 3 feet away. And so they would block their vision. The child would throw the beanbag and show where it lands and try it again and again. The other group, the children were throwing at a 2-foot and 4-foot target. So they'd block their vision, throw to 2 feet, show them where how they did. Block the vision, throw to a 4-foot target. Block their vision 2 foot and alternate 4-2, 4-2. Then they had the competition between the two groups throwing at a 3-foot target. Guess who won handily? The group that never threw to a 3-foot target. So then they said, okay, we need to repeat this. And they did it with 12-year-olds and got even more dramatic results. Another place where interleaving works. In this study, they were trying to teach people how to identify who an artist was. You show them a painting, and then you'd say, oh, that's a Van Gogh, or that's a Monet, for instance. So in the block group, they would show them like 20 Van Goghs, then 20 Monets, 20 Matisse, and so forth. In the interleaved group, what they would do was look at 1 Van Gogh, 2 Monets, 1 Lautrec, 3 Van Goghs, looked at the same number of paintings, the same paintings. Then in the test, they would be shown a Van Gogh, for instance, that they'd never seen before, wasn't part of their studying session. And the ones with the interleaving got 65% correct. The ones who did it masked or blocked only got 50%. But the interesting thing is 80% of the participants all said, no, the blocked approach is better. You know, even though the evidence was there for them to see that interleaving was better. Okay, one more study. Okay, in this one, the subjects were taught how to find volumes of three-dimensional objects. Okay, so group one, the practice was clustered by type. So they might work 10 problems of finding volumes of a wedge, then 10 of a half cone, and 10 of a spheroid. The other group, the problems were all mixed. They might do one wedge, 2 half cones, 1 spherical cone, 3 spheroids, and so forth. The ones who did it in blocks scored 60% on the test. The ones who did it interleaving got 89% right. They were tested again a week later. The blocked ones only got 20% of them right. The interleaved ones got 63% of them right. Now, interleaving is more typical of what you're going to encounter on a test. Okay, there's mixed problem sets, and part of what you have to do is figure out what the problem pertains to and calling that mental model to solve that particular problem. And that's also what you run into in life. You're not told by your boss, okay, here's a project for you, start by using the Pythagorean theorem to find something, you know. So with block learning, you know, the rapid learning is pretty apparent. You look at 20 Van Goghs and you think you got it down, but you plateau. With the interleaving, you keep getting better and better. So it seems harder because it's slower at first, but in the long run, you learn more. You learn it deeper. Okay, so now let me talk about preparation and incubation. Okay, preparation is something you do consciously. Incubation is something you do subconsciously. It's like getting something for not putting any effort in your studying. Okay, so preparation would be, you know, you're sitting at your desk, you're working, you're trying to solve problems. Incubation occurs later. You've worked on a problem and you weren't able to solve it. So you go get a cup of coffee, you go to sleep, you go for a walk, you take a shower, and not even thinking about it, an idea may come to you of how to solve that problem. Or when you sit back down and look at it, you have an idea of how to approach the problem. Okay, your mind keeps working on the problem. Okay, this is also where space learning is good, because if you're spacing, you're giving yourself a lot more incubation episodes to help you learn and connect things. And there's a lot of anecdotes of people who've seen this happen. This is one from Hermann von Helmholtz, who's made many contributions in different scientific fields. He said, "Happy ideas come unexpectedly without effort, like an inspiration. So far as I am concerned, they never come to me when my mind was fatigued or when I was at my working table. They came particularly readily during the slow ascent of a wooded hill on a sunny day." So this was known a long time ago. Wallas outlined it in 1926. He said the first part is that preparation where you're focused on your problem or what you're trying to learn. Then comes the incubation, when you're doing something completely different, not even thinking of the problem, and then you figure out how to do it. Okay, so let me leave you at this point with some examples of where you probably need incubation to come up with the solution. So you have this set of dimes and you're asked to move 3 of them and form a triangle that points down. When I looked at this, I couldn't figure out how to do it. And I actually woke up the next morning and had a solution. Turned out it wasn't the solution that the book wanted, but it was a solution. Okay? And I won't show you the answers to any of these so you can have some incubation. I'll do it next week. Okay, this one you might get. This equation contains 3 errors. You know, focused thinking, you immediately see 2. You might get the third one. This one's not that hard, but it may take some some time. Or this one, connect the dots with 4 continuous straight lines. So let me try this drawing again if I can. So just follow my pointer here. So here's 1 line, 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines, and I missed these 2 dots, okay? So you have to figure out how to do the 4 lines and hit all the dots. Now this incubation is very useful if you have a large project. Like when you were undergraduates, you may have had to do a senior design, which was a semester long. You might have had a long paper to write. You might someday be writing a thesis, a large computer program. And at first you might not really know how to get started on it, but you need to. You just sit down and try to do something. And a day or 2 later, go back to it. And what you'll find is you'll keep figuring out things that you can try, and you'll keep making progress because of all the things you're coming up with during your incubation periods. Okay, so now let's talk about deliberate practice. Okay, so for over 40 years, Anders Ericsson has been studying what makes someone an expert at the top of their field, whether it's an athlete, musician, mathematician, teacher, surgeon, whatever. Okay, and here's 2 quotes from his book, Peak. First one is, learning isn't a way of reaching one's potential, but rather a way of developing it. And I'll really emphasize this next time when I talk about mindsets. Here I want to emphasize that the right sort of practice carried out over a sufficient period of time leads to improvement. Nothing else. Okay, so it's not your innate talent that gets you better at something, it's how you're practicing that gets you better. So when he was starting out as an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, he wanted to see if people can improve their short-term memory. Okay, so typically you can hold 6 or 7 digits in your head. So if I say 8675309, you can remember that to punch in your phone, 8675309. Or you're familiar with the song by that title. Okay, so he hired this undergrad, Steve Falloon, and he met with him 3 times a week. And so what he would do is he would say 1347, and Steve would say 1347. Then he'd go to 56789, 56789 was Steve's response, until he missed a digit. Then he would back off, starting with a smaller number of digits. This went on for a few weeks. Steve was a little frustrated. He wasn't getting any better. I mean, your short-term memory is fixed. It's not going to get better than, say, 6 or 7 digits. But Steve was a serious runner. Okay, and this will come back next week when we talk about grit. But Steve was a serious runner. And maybe one time he saw 3 digits like 445, and he goes, that's my record for running the mile. So now he didn't remember 455 as that one piece in short-term memory. He remembered how long it took him to run a mile. So he got 10 digits that time. So then he started, instead of just naively practicing and just trying to repeat digits, his practice now was trying to associate something with every set of 3 digits from 100 to 999. So once he got that, he could easily do 21 digits every time. And so he kept coming up with these different mental models through this deliberate practice, and he eventually got to 82 digits. And back then, that was amazing. No one else had ever done that. He was like a minor celebrity, would appear on some TV shows and things. Here's another example. So in this study, they took 3 groups of people, national level chess players, mid-range, and novices. And they showed them a chessboard. And the pieces were either in the middle of a game somewhere or they were randomly placed. And they got a few seconds to look at it. And then they were asked to place all the pieces. The national players could pretty much put all the pieces in place from having seen the board for just a few seconds, if it was in the middle of the game. A mid-range player about a half, a novice of about 4. If they were randomly placed, they all did about the same. It was their short-term memory recall, just to be able to get a few pieces right. So when the national players were looking at it in the middle of the game, they weren't seeing individual pieces. They were seeing a bigger picture. And they didn't get that way by just playing game after game after game. They did it by doing deliberate practice. So in chess, it would be like studying chess games that other masters have played and trying to figure out why they made certain moves. Be looking at games you played and maybe lost and figuring out where you made your mistake and so forth. Let me give you another example. Memorize that list of words. Yeah, you could probably get 6 of them right. But if I show you the words like this, regular training leads to changes in the brain challenged by that training. You don't see the individual words, you see a sentence that's telling you something, so you can remember something larger. Oh, and I should go back and mention with Steve Falloon, he didn't increase his short-term memory. He just came up with these mental models to remember larger digits. If you gave him letters instead, he could only remember 6 or 7 of them. Okay, so with the sentence, you have a meaning now which aids your memory. Okay, so when you're trying to learn something, you should approach it as learning the material and not going after a grade. You don't want to try to memorize just how past problems were worked or procedures for solving something. You want to understand the concept and have this mental model of it so that how you solve it comes naturally out of that. Then the grades will come. Okay, so let's talk about the testing effect. Okay, so we, as students and as instructors, view testing as an assessment, but it's actually a very effective learning tool. It's a deliberate practice. Okay, it's a retrieval exercise. You have to recall things to be able to solve a problem. As you're struggling with the problem on an exam, you're probably working and forming connections with other things, other models you have in your mind. If you're taking tests often, it keeps you on tasks. It interrupts that forgetting. You discover gaps in your knowledge that you can then go back and learn in your next study episode. So here is a study on testing by Roediger and Karpicki. Roediger was a longtime faculty member here at Purdue, and Karpicki is currently a faculty member here in psychological sciences. And what they did was they took 120 undergraduates and they had them study 2 scientific passages. One was on the sun and one was on sea otters. Okay, so the first group studied each passage for 7 minutes, and they did it twice. The second group studied the passage for 7 minutes, but instead of studying it again, in 7 minutes, they wrote down all they could recall of the article. Okay? So one portion of them were tested 5 minutes later. So the study group did a little better than the study test group. But if you go out 2 days, you see that the study test group did significantly better than the group that had the study sessions. And a week later, it was even bigger discrepancy. So it was much more effective doing that recall exercise than spending the time rereading those passages. So testing isn't equal to studying. Testing is actually greater than studying. So let's talk about how to study. But first, how not to study. Okay, you don't want to just keep rereading your book like those students who reread those scientific passages twice. You don't want to keep going over your notes. Actually, there's a way I'm going to tell you to read your text, but I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so you don't want to spend all this time rereading, highlighting, and looking at your highlights, or glancing at solutions to problems, or doing math study. These are things that Eric Anderson would call naive practice. And one of the things that happens if you keep rereading your text is you get familiar with something, but you don't really know it. Okay, so for instance, you're all very familiar with the Apple logo. Without looking at your phones or back of someone's computers, can you pick out which one's right? Okay, so let me tell you how to really study. Again, you're studying to learn, and the grades are going to come. You do have to spend some time reading your text, and I want to come back to that in a minute. You want to do these retrieval or recall exercises. Okay, so let's say some of the things I've been telling you today is interesting and you think are useful. So tonight, sit down, pull out a piece of paper, and see what you can write down about what I talked about today. When you're walking to your next class, recall what you did in class the last time. Those are very powerful tools for learning. Okay, and you want to space things. You want to work problems, but if you get stuck, you don't want to look at solutions. You want to let it sit for a while, at least till the next day. Give yourself a chance to have that incubation occurring, and maybe the solution will come to you. You want to explain the material out loud. Okay, there was a study where they took 2 groups and they worked the same problems. One group worked them in silence. The other group, they told them to verbalize every step. The ones who were talking out loud to themselves got many more of the problems right. Okay. Take a past exam and work it just like you would, same conditions you would have when you have to take the test. Same amount of time, no extra study aids, and so forth. Then just leave it. Okay, probably problems you couldn't get and you couldn't get, but don't look at the solution. Wait until the next day. The solution may come to you, and if it does, then you've learned it much deeper. You've probably all had that experience where you took an exam, you couldn't do a problem, and when you're not thinking about it, a couple hours later you go, I know how to do it now. You want that to happen when you're studying, not when you're taking the test. Okay, so the next day, if the solution hasn't come to you, then it's fine to look at the solution and figure out how to do the problem. Then take another sample test and do the same thing. So this is going to require you not to start the day before and cram all day. You won't put any more time in studying, but spread it out over a week instead to give all these periods of incubation, and all these periods of spaced learning for your memory to occur. If you run out of tests, try to write some exam problems. If you can start writing exam problems like you're seeing on your exam, you're ready for that exam. And you can also go back to your first exam. If it was a week ago, remember your forgetting curve? It'd be almost like a new test for you. And this testing effect has been known for 80 years. Back in 1939, immediate recall in the form of a test is an effective method of aiding the retention of learning and should therefore be employed more frequently. So here's a survey that was done at Washington University. Again, Karpicki and Rodiger are part of this study. They had 11 strategies for learning, and they asked students, which ones do you employ? Which ones would you rank number one? So rereading the notes and book, 84% of them used that, and 55%, that was their number one way of studying. And we know that's not the most effective way of studying. Doing practice problems, only 43% and only 12% ranked at number one. This recall self-testing, where you just think about what you did in class last time, only about 11% used it, and only 1% as their number one method. Okay, so clearly a lot of improvement in learning could be done for these 177 students if they readjusted and did more deliberate practice. Now I'll tell you about reading your text. And this is a result from 1917. Okay, so they had people studying things, and they would interrupt them and say, look up and recall what you've been reading. Okay, and they found that if you're interrupted and spend 60% of your time recalling what you've been reading, is about the best. So you want, if you're reading something, you only want to spend 40%, of your time during that reading episode actually reading. 60% of the time, you want to be stopping and thinking and recalling what you've been reading. Now most of your studying really has to be done alone. That's how you really learn. But study groups can help in a few ways. For one thing, if you really have an error in your thinking, it's a quick way to figure that out in a study group. The other thing, it's an opportunity to explain things out loud. And as we've seen, that aids in learning. So if you're the one in the study group explaining everything, you're the one learning. It helps you become comfortable explaining things to others, which is useful. You'll probably have to give a presentation in a class, or when you go on a job interview, you're going to have to do something like that. It's also a quick way to determine errors in credible sources. So textbooks have errors in them. Your instructors will tell you something that's not correct sometimes. Make sure, though, it's just not doing it to have a socializing session. You should take advantage of office hours. Okay, one goal you should have is to get to know one professor a semester. Okay, so why would you want to do that? Well, when you go to graduate, you're going to need references. So you need to get a professor or professors to know you. The best way is if you frequent office hours. If you're a shy introvert like me, I never went to office hours, find a friend for some moral support to go. Other advantage, if the professor knows you and it's, looking to put in cutoffs and sees your name, If you're near the cutoff, it's likely the cutoff will be below your name instead of above it then, right? Okay, so you all taught, right? You have a learning style, and that's the best way for you to learn, right? Is it something you hear in schools? That's not true at all. Right? You have preferences. You might like to see things. You might like to read better. You might like to hear. But studies show you don't really learn better based on your learning preferences. For instance, think back to identifying the artist who painted a picture. If you're auditory, you think the best way to learn is someone describing you what Van Gogh paintings look like, or actually looking at a few Van Gogh paintings. What is known is that the more senses you bring to bear, the better you're learning. So you want to hear things, you want to see things, you want to touch. That's why writing and taking notes in class is important. I mean, those are all additional retrieval cues you're building in. You've all had that experience. You heard a song, it takes you back to some other point in your life you remember. Or you smell a fragrance and it reminds you of something. So you're in class now. There's this effect that you probably listened to me for like the first 10 minutes. Right now, there's a lot of daydreaming going on. In about 10 minutes, you'll start thinking, oh, I'm going to get out of here soon, and you're kind of waking up, and you'll hear what I say at the end of class. Right? So you really want your classes to go like this, where you get reoriented back to listening to what's going on. Some instructors are good at that. They say something funny every 10 minutes or so, and everyone laughs, and you're reoriented. Or they show a demonstration or an animation or something. Another way for this to happen, if that's not happening with your instructor, is if you're asking questions. Because if someone over here, you get a different voice coming from a different location, it gets everyone's attention. And it's likely at that point no one's listening, so everyone wants to know the answer to your question anyway. Right? We evolved to reorient very quickly. If 40,000 years ago you didn't pay attention to this rustling over here, you were lunch for a saber-toothed tiger. Your ancestors paid attention. That's why you're here. And the act of creating questions is you're actively participating in the lecture. And you want, if you wait too long, you've all had that experience that now you couldn't even ask a question because you haven't understood anything that's gone on now for 20 minutes because you missed something 20 minutes ago. Okay, here's an interesting study that was done at the University of Michigan. So in the class, all the students had a computer monitor in front of them, and they could view the PowerPoint slides. The instructor could ask a question for the students to respond so he could see, if they were learning what he was talking about. They were able to type in and take notes, and they were also able to indicate if there was something confusing them at this point. So the instructor could see that the confusion's going up, maybe I need to recover something. So here's an interesting result. The students that scored greater than 90% on the exam were taking like 60% more notes than the students who were scoring average on the exam. They were also indicating they were confused much more than the students who were getting average scores on the exam. Okay, so note-taking is an important part of the learning process. You're more actively participating in the lecture. Here's some other interesting statistics. So, of the students coming into that class, those who had a greater than 3.5 GPA took 4 times as many notes as those coming into the class with a GPA under 3. And even more important is if you take those notes, take them with pencil and paper. There have been other studies to show that that's even better than taking notes with a laptop. You're getting more of your sense of touch involved in the learning process and providing cues for you for retrieving the information later. And it's not surprising, your hands are made for learning, right? You know, you'd squeeze something to see a piece of fruit, you go in the supermarket, you still squeeze it to see if it's edible. You know, 20,000 years ago, rock's hard, I can hit something with it and have my dinner. And, you know, keyboards, you just don't get that same sensory input as you do when you're writing. And actually, I think this is probably a good stopping point for today, because the next subject I want to talk about is a real interesting one, a really important one, and I'd rather do it in that first part of the class where you're all awake and paying attention, not when you're already sleeping. Okay, so are there any questions? Okay, so I'll see you next week then.